Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Chance of Moonlight. The night sky over Montreal sparkled with 1,000 stars, their brilliance amplified by the crisp winter air. Snowflakes cascaded lazily, painting the bustling city in a glistening white hue. Among the crowd of bundled pedestrians, Amara hurried through the streets, clutching a leather-bound notebook to her chest. Her breath formed misty clouds as she walked, the cold biting through her woolen scarf. Amara was new to the city, an artist from a small coastal town who had come to study visual arts. Despite the crowded streets, she often felt an aching loneliness in the chaos. Tonight she headed to an open mic event at a tiny, dimly lit cafe tucked away in an old part of town. The cafe was a haven for poets, singers, and dreamers, a refuge for those seeking connection. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and baked goods. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and candles flickered on mismatched tables. The stage was modest, a single spotlight casting a warm glow on the microphone stand. Amara settled into a corner seat, nervously thumbing through her notebook. She had rewritten her piece a dozen times, but the words never seemed right. She wasn't even sure if she'd gather the courage to go on stage. Then he walked in. His entrance was understated yet magnetic. A tall, lean figure wrapped in a navy coat, snowflakes clinging to his dark, wavy hair. His eyes, strikingly green, swept the room, landing on an empty stool near the stage. Amara watched as he shrugged off his coat and settled in, pulling out a sketch pad and a pencil. For the next hour, Amara's focus was split between the performers and the stranger, who seemed lost in his drawings. She caught glimpses of his work, a rough sketch of a guitarist on stage, the folds of a cafe curtain, and even a quick study of the barista behind the counter. When her name was called, her stomach clenched. She hesitated, but something in her told her to go through with it. As she approached the stage, her hands trembled. The spotlight was blinding, and for a moment all she could hear was the rapid thud of her own heartbeat. She opened her notebook, her voice shaky as she began. Her poem was raw, a piece about finding beauty in solitude and strength in vulnerability. The room was silent, hanging on every word. When she finished, a smattering of applause followed, warm and encouraging. She glanced at the stranger as she returned to her seat. He was smiling softly, his gaze thoughtful. The evening wore on, and as the crowd thinned, Amara lingered, her eyes drifting to the stranger. To her surprise, he approached her, his sketch pad tucked under one arm. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You've got a way with words." "Thank you," she murmured, feeling her cheeks flush. "I'm Leo," he said, extending a hand. "Amara." They talked for hours, the world outside fading into the background. Leo was an architecture student with a love for sketching people and places. They discovered a shared appreciation for capturing fleeting moments, the way a smile could light up a face, the way shadows danced on snowy streets. As the night stretched into early morning, they walked together through the city, their footprints side by side in the snow. The streets were nearly deserted, the quiet hum of the city replaced by the gentle crunch of their steps. But just as Amara felt something shift, a connection sparking between them, Leo paused. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression turning serious. Amara's heart sank, bracing herself for the confession she thought would come. A girlfriend, a secret, an unspoken goodbye. But instead he said, "You won't believe me, but I've met you before." "What?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "In my dreams," he said softly. "I've sketched your face 100 times before tonight." He handed her his sketch pad. Flipping through the pages, Amara froze. There she was, her face, her hair, her expressions, captured in charcoal strokes. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I know this. We're meant to meet, and I think we've done this before." As the first rays of sunlight touched the city, their conversation carried on, unraveling mysteries neither of them could explain. Amara's loneliness began to fade, replaced by something strange and electric, a feeling that the universe had whispered her name long before she ever set foot in Montreal. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Snow. The city stirred to life as dawn painted the skyline in hues of orange and pink. Amara and Leo wandered aimlessly, their footsteps guided more by instinct than direction. The revelation of Leo's dream sketches lingered between them like unspoken poetry, an impossible truth they both hesitated to question. "So, you're saying you dreamed of me? Before tonight?" Amara asked, clutching the sketch pad tightly as they turned down a quiet alley. The air smelled of freshly baked bread from a nearby boulangerie. "Yes," Leo said simply. "For months. Sometimes I'd wake up with your face so vivid in my mind that I had to draw it. Other times it was just a feeling. A presence, maybe. But always you." Amara looked at him, her breath visible in the frosty air. She didn't know what to say. The rational part of her wanted to dismiss it as a strange coincidence, but deep down, something about his story felt right. Familiar, even. "Do you believe in fate?" Leo asked suddenly, his green eyes searching hers. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to, but it's hard to believe in something you can't see or touch." He nodded, as if he understood. "That's how I felt. Until now." The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine, and she quickly looked away, pretending to admire the street art on a nearby wall. It depicted a pair of wings, one golden and one black, their feathers blending at the tips. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, tracing her gloved fingers over the edge of the sketch pad. "I didn't want to scare you off," he said. "It's not exactly something you bring up over coffee." Amara chuckled despite herself. Fair point. They walked on in silence for a while, the city's sounds growing louder as the morning progressed. Eventually, they found themselves in a small park, the snow pristine except for the occasional trail of footprints. A frozen fountain stood in the center, its intricate carvings cloaked in ice. "Wait here," Leo said, his voice tinged with excitement. Before she could respond, he jogged to a bench and pulled out his pencil and a fresh sheet of paper from his satchel. Amara watched as his hands moved quickly, the pencil scratching the surface in broad, confident strokes. "What are you doing?" she called out, curious. "Sketching," he replied without looking up. "I need to capture this moment." Amara laughed softly and sat down on the fountain's edge, letting the cold seep through her coat. She felt like she was in the middle of one of his sketches, like time had paused, holding its breath just for them. But as she waited, her thoughts turned darker. What if this connection wasn't the gift it seemed to be? What if it was a warning? When Leo finally returned, his sketch was complete. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable. Amara gasped. It wasn't the park she saw on the page, or even herself sitting by the fountain. Instead, the sketch depicted a stormy night, with her standing at the edge of a cliff, her hair whipping in the wind. Behind her, a figure, Leo, was reaching out, his hand inches from hers. What is this?" she stammered, her fingers trembling as she held the drawing. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet. "I started drawing the park, but it turned into this." Amara stared at the image, a chill creeping up her spine. The scene felt eerily familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. "You've drawn this before, haven't you?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Once, a long time ago." Their eyes met, and for the first time Amara saw fear in Leo's expression. "Amara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think I've lost you before." The weight of his words hung heavily between them. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as some artist's fancy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we're supposed to figure it out. Together." Amara closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. When she opened them again, Leo was watching her, his gaze steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Then let's start now," she said firmly, handing him the sketch. Leo nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his uncertainty. "Okay, but I think we need to go back." "Back where?" "To the place where it all began," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. Amara hesitated. She didn't know what he meant, but something inside her, something primal and inexplicable, urged her to trust him. As they left the park, the snow began to fall again, softer this time, like a curtain closing on the first act of a play. But in the shadows, unnoticed by either of them, a black feather drifted to the ground, melting into the snow like it had never been there at all. Chapter 3: The Echo of Before. The train rattled softly as it sped through the snow-blanketed countryside. Amara and Leo sat side by side, their reflections blurred in the frosted window. Leo had insisted they leave Montreal and head south toward a small village nestled in the Laurentian Mountains. He had no clear reason for choosing it, only a feeling, a pull he couldn't explain. Amara had packed hastily, throwing a sketchbook, a camera, and a few clothes into her bag. Now, as the city gave way to endless white fields and skeletal forests, doubt began to creep in. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, her voice low. Leo glanced at her, his green eyes thoughtful. "And what if we're right?" She didn't reply, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. There was something about him, his certainty, his quiet intensity, that made her want to believe. The train pulled into a small, snow-dusted station just after noon. The village was quiet, its streets lined with quaint stone cottages and lampposts adorned with evergreen wreaths. Amara felt a strange déjà vu as they walked down the main road, the air sharp with the scent of pine and chimney smoke. "Do you know where we're going?" she asked, trailing behind Leo as he studied a map in his hand. "Not exactly," he admitted. "But there's a chapel at the edge of the village. I think we'll find answers there." "A chapel?" she repeated, skepticism creeping into her voice. "It's not just any chapel," he said, folding the map. "It's the one I've dreamed about. I've drawn it, too, dozens of times." Amara didn't argue. She followed him down a winding path that led out of the village, the snow crunching under their boots. The sky was overcast, the sun a pale disk behind thick clouds. After half an hour, they reached a clearing where the chapel stood. It was small and weathered, its stone walls cloaked in ivy and snow. A rusted iron bell hung in a wooden tower, swaying gently in the wind. Leo stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. "This is it," he said softly. Amara's heart pounded as they approached. Something about the chapel felt heavy, as though the air around it carried memories too old to comprehend. Inside, the air was cold and still. Stained glass windows cast muted colors across the wooden pews, and the faint scent of wax lingered from candles long extinguished. At the front of the chapel stood an altar, simple and unadorned. Amara felt an inexplicable urge to move closer. As she approached the altar, she noticed a carving etched into the stone floor, a circular emblem with intricate symbols she couldn't decipher. "Leo," she called, her voice echoing in the empty space. He joined her, his eyes widening as he saw the emblem. "I've seen this before," he murmured, kneeling to trace the carving with his fingers. "In your dreams?" He nodded. "It always shows up, but I never understood what it meant." Amara crouched beside him, the cool stone pressing against her knees. She reached out to touch the emblem, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a sharp jolt ran through her body. She gasped, pulling her hand back. "Amara? Are you okay?" Leo asked, alarmed. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "I felt something, like a memory." Leo looked at her intently. "What did you see?" She closed her eyes, the image flashing in her mind like an old photograph. A stormy night, the edge of a cliff, her hands clutching the fabric of a dark coat. "I saw us," she whispered. "But it wasn't here. It was somewhere else. And it was—" Her voice broke. It was the end of something. Leo's jaw tightened, and he sat back on his heels. "I think this place is a doorway," he said, his voice low. "A doorway to what? To whatever came before," he replied. "To whatever keeps pulling us back together." Amara stared at him, her heart racing. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was all just a strange coincidence. But she couldn't. The feeling inside her was too strong, too undeniable. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Leo stood and offered her his hand. "We open the door." Amara hesitated, then took his hand. Together, they pressed their palms against the emblem. The room seemed to tremble, a low hum vibrating through the air. The stained glass windows darkened, their colors shifting like liquid. A cold wind swept through the chapel, carrying whispers that Amara couldn't understand. And then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, the floor beneath them disappeared. They fell into darkness, the world spinning around them. For a moment there was nothing but cold and silence. Then, slowly, shapes began to form. A rocky cliff, a turbulent sea, and a sky heavy with storm clouds. Amara and Leo stood on the edge of the cliff, just as she had seen in her vision. The wind tore at their clothes, and the roar of the waves drowned out all other sounds. "This is it," Leo said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Amara turned to him, fear and wonder mingling in her expression. "Why are we here?" "Because this is where it ended," he said, "and it's where we have to begin again." As he spoke, the shadows around them shifted. From the darkness emerged a figure, cloaked and faceless, its presence sending a chill through the air. "You've come back," the figure said, its voice a haunting echo. Amara clutched Leo's arm, her eyes wide. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing at the emblem now glowing faintly beneath their feet. "You must choose," it said. "The cycle cannot be broken without sacrifice." Leo stepped forward, shielding Amara with his body. "What sacrifice?" he demanded. The figure tilted its head, its silence more terrifying than any answer. And then, as the storm raged around them, Amara realized the truth. The choice wasn't between life and death, but between holding on and letting go. She turned to Leo, tears streaming down her face. "I remember now," she said. "We've been here before, and every time, one of us lets go." His eyes filled with anguish, but he didn't move. "Not this time," he said fiercely. Amara shook her head, her heart breaking. "We have to, or we'll never escape this." The figure watched silently as Amara stepped forward, her hand hovering over the glowing emblem. Leo reached for her, his voice breaking. "Amara, don't." But she smiled through her tears, her hand pressing down on the emblem. The light engulfed them, and the world dissolved once more. Chapter 4. The Threads of Forever. Amara opened her eyes, gasping for air as if she'd been drowning. The world was a blur of color and sound, spinning and shifting like a kaleidoscope. Slowly, the chaos settled, and she found herself standing in a place she didn't recognize, yet it felt achingly familiar. The air shimmered with golden light, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, like moss, but it pulsed faintly, almost as if it were alive. All around her stretched an endless expanse of trees, their branches tangled with threads of light that twisted and swayed, connecting everything in sight. "Amara!" She turned and saw Leo stumbling toward her, his face pale and his eyes wide with relief. Without thinking, she ran to him, throwing her arms around him. He held her tightly, his grip trembling. "You're here," he breathed. "I thought I lost you." "You almost did," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I thought I—" She trailed off, looking around. "Where are we?" Leo pulled back slightly, his gaze scanning their surroundings. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's not the cliff. It's something else." Amara looked up at the threads of light above them, their glow soft and constant. She reached out instinctively, and her fingers brushed against one of the threads. A flash of images filled her mind, moments of her life, both mundane and profound. Her first day at school, sketching by the ocean. Meeting Leo in the cafe, she gasped, pulling her hand back. "What is it?" Leo asked, his concern deepening. "I think these threads," she said, her voice shaking. "They're memories, not just mine, everyone's. They're connected." Leo stared at the glowing threads, his expression a mix of wonder and apprehension. "It's like the fabric of existence," he murmured. "Everything we've done, everything we are." Before Amara could respond, a ripple passed through the threads, their light dimming briefly. The ground beneath them trembled, and a cold wind swept through the trees. "That can't be good," Amara said, her voice tight. From the shadows between the trees, the figure from the cliff emerged. It looked the same, cloaked, faceless, but here its presence was even more imposing. The threads of light recoiled from it, their glow flickering as if in fear. "You have come far," the figure said, its voice echoing like the toll of a bell. "But you still do not understand." "Then tell us," Leo demanded, stepping in front of Amara. "What is this place? Why are we here?" The figure tilted its head, the silence stretching before it finally spoke. "This is the between," it said. "The space where all lifetimes converge, where every choice and every consequence is woven into the tapestry of existence." Amara frowned, her mind racing. "Then why bring us here? What do you want from us?" The figure pointed at the threads above them. "Your lives are bound by a single thread," it said. "It has been cut and rewoven many times. Always it frays, always it fails." Leo glanced at Amara, his expression troubled. "And what happens if it fails again?" "The cycle continues," the figure replied. "You will return to the beginning as you always have, repeating the same fate." Amara's chest tightened. "You mean we've been living the same lives? Over and over?" The figure nodded. "Your bond is powerful, but it is flawed. One of you always chooses to let go." Her mind flashed back to the cliff, to the storm, to Leo reaching for her. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "And if we don't let go? If we hold on?" The figure's shadowy form seemed to ripple, its tone unyielding. Then you must mend the thread. But to do so requires a sacrifice. Another sacrifice? Leo asked, his frustration evident. We've already given everything. The figure extended a hand, and a single thread of light floated between them. It shimmered with a pale, silvery glow, trembling as if it carried the weight of all their lives. This is your thread, the figure said. To mend it, one of you must give up your connection to this place, to memory, to everything you have been. Amara's breath caught. What does that mean? It means one of us disappears, Leo said quietly, his voice hollow. We break the cycle, but only one of us keeps going. The weight of the decision crushed down on them. Amara's heart ached, her mind racing through every memory they'd shared, every fleeting moment that had brought them here. No, she said firmly. There has to be another way. We can find it. There isn't, Leo said, his voice breaking. I've felt it from the moment we met. This was always going to be the ending. Amara's eyes filled with tears. Then it'll be me, she said. No. Leo shook his head, stepping closer to her. Not you. I've dreamed of you for so long, Amara. You need to keep going. You need to live. And leave you here? She said, her voice rising. How is that living? The figure stood silently, its presence a cold reminder that time was slipping away. The thread between them dimmed further, its glow flickering like a dying flame. Amara turned to Leo, her tears falling freely. We've lost each other so many times, she said. I don't want to lose you again. You won't, he said softly, cupping her face with his hands. You'll carry me with you, in every sketch, every word, every breath. Amara shook her head, but she knew he was right. Promise me, Leo said, his voice cracking. Promise me you'll keep going. She nodded, her sobs choking her words. I promise. Leo smiled through his tears, and before she could stop him, he turned to the figure. Take me, he said. Mend the thread. The figure raised its hand, and the light enveloped Leo, pulling him away from her. Amara screamed, reaching for him, but it was too late. The threads above them shimmered, their light growing brighter as the ground beneath her feet steadied. The figure and Leo disappeared, leaving her alone in the golden forest. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest, her heart breaking. But as the light of the threads surrounded her, she felt a warmth. Leo's presence, his essence, woven into the very fabric of her being. When she finally opened her eyes, she was back in Montreal. The snow was falling softly, the city alive with the sounds of morning. In her hand was Leo's sketchpad, its pages blank except for one, a single drawing of her, standing beneath the glowing threads. And in the corner of the page, written in Leo's familiar handwriting, were the words, For Amara, live well and remember me. Tears streaming down her face, she clutched the sketchpad to her chest. The cycle was broken, but the bond remained, eternal and unyielding. Chapter 5, The Weight of a Promise. The snow continued to fall as Amara stood on the steps of her apartment building, clutching Leo's sketchpad. The city bustled around her, indifferent to the ache that consumed her. People passed by, their hurried footsteps muffled by the snow, their laughter and conversation a stark contrast to the silence in her heart. But something about Montreal felt different now, alive in a way she had never noticed before. The air hummed faintly, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Amara glanced at the sketchpad, her fingers tracing Leo's handwriting. Live well, and remember me. I'll try, she whispered, the words dissipating into the cold air. Inside her apartment, she placed the sketchpad on her desk and opened it again. The drawing of her beneath the glowing threads stared back at her, haunting and beautiful. As she flipped through the pages, faint impressions began to emerge, drawings not fully realized, as if Leo's memories were trying to resurface through the paper. One sketch caught her attention. It was of the chapel where they had found the emblem, but this time there were small details she hadn't noticed before. A star-shaped engraving on the bell tower and an open doorway leading to what looked like another room. Amara's heart raced. Could this be a clue? A message from Leo? She grabbed her coat and the sketchpad and hurried out the door, her boots crunching against the icy pavement. The chapel was hours away by train, but she didn't care. If there was even the slightest chance that Leo had left her something, anything, she had to find it. The journey to the village felt longer this time. the snowstorm intensifying as the train crawled through the countryside. Amara pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her thoughts racing. What if she was wrong? What if this was just her mind clinging to hope, unable to let go of Leo? But then she remembered the glow of the threads, the way they had pulsed with life. She couldn't explain it, but she knew there was more to their story. When she finally arrived at the small station, the village was cloaked in snow, its streets almost deserted. The path to the chapel was harder to navigate now, buried beneath fresh drifts, but Amara pushed forward, her determination unwavering. By the time she reached the clearing, her cheeks were flushed and her breath came in short, visible bursts. The chapel stood before her, silent and solemn, just as it had been before. Inside, the air was colder than she remembered. The stained glass windows were dark, the pews coated in a fine layer of frost. The emblem on the floor seemed dull, its intricate symbols barely visible in the dim light. Amara walked to the front of the chapel, the sketch pad clutched tightly in her hands. She glanced up at the bell tower, her eyes searching for the star-shaped engraving. It was there, faint but unmistakable. "Okay, Leo," she whispered. "What am I supposed to do?" As if in answer, a soft breeze swept through the chapel, stirring the pages of the sketch pad. Amara watched as the paper flipped to a blank page, except it wasn't blank anymore. Words had appeared, written in the same handwriting as before. "The door opens with light." Amara frowned, her breath catching. She looked around, her eyes falling on the altar. A single candle sat atop it, its wick unlit. Without hesitating, she searched her pockets and found a lighter. Her hands shook as she struck the flame and held it to the wick. The moment the candle caught fire, the emblem on the floor began to glow faintly. Amara stepped back, her heart pounding as the glow intensified. The light spread from the emblem, racing along the walls and up to the bell tower. A deep, resonant chime filled the chapel, and the air shimmered like it had in the forest of threads. Then a doorway appeared at the back of the chapel, where there had been only stone before. Amara stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. The doorway pulsed with the same golden light she had seen in the between. It felt like an invitation and a test. Her legs felt heavy as she moved toward the doorway, each step carrying the weight of her promise to Leo. She reached out a trembling hand and pushed the door open. The space beyond was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was vast and boundless, a swirling expanse of light and shadow. Threads of every color stretched across the void, weaving patterns too complex for her mind to comprehend. At the center of it all was a figure, a man, his form shimmering like it was made of starlight. "Leo?" Amara whispered, her voice breaking. The figure turned, and though his features were indistinct, she knew it was him. "Amara," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "you found the door." Tears blurred her vision as she took a step closer. "I thought you were gone," she said. "I am," he replied, "but not in the way you think." She shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't understand." Leo reached out, his hand passing through hers like mist. "This is where I exist now," he said. "A part of the threads, a part of everything." Amara's heart ached. "I don't want to lose you again." "You haven't," he said gently. "I'm in every thread you touch, every memory you make. But you need to live, Amara. Really live." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "How do I do that without you?" Leo smiled, the light around him pulsing softly. "By letting me go, but not forgetting. By finding joy, even when it feels impossible." Amara closed her eyes, the tears streaming down her face. When she opened them, Leo was fading, his form dissolving into the threads around them. "Wait!" she called, panic rising in her chest. But his voice came to her, calm and steady. "I'll always be with you, Amara, in the light, in the threads." And then he was gone. Amara stepped back into the chapel, the doorway disappearing behind her. The candle on the altar had burned down to a stub, its flame flickering weakly before going out. She stood in the quiet, her breath steadying. The pain in her chest was still there, but it was softer now, like an ache she could learn to live with. As she walked back to the village, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the snow. Amara paused, looking up at the sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. She didn't know where the threads would take her, but she knew one thing for certain. She would keep living. For Leo. For herself. and for the promise she had made. Chapter 6. The Thread Unbroken. The weeks that followed Amara's journey back to the chapel were a blur of quiet grief and slow rebuilding. Leo's absence was a wound, sharp and raw, but over time, the edges softened. She began to see him in the smallest details of her days, in the golden light that filtered through her window, in the rustling of leaves, and in the quiet hum of the city. The sketchpad remained on her desk, a constant reminder of him. Every now and then, Amara would open it, hoping to find another message, another drawing, but the pages stayed still and blank. Yet the weight of it comforted her, as though Leo's presence lingered just beneath the surface. She returned to her art, hesitant at first. Her hands felt awkward holding a pencil again, her strokes clumsy, her sketches incomplete. But she pressed on, filling page after page with fragments of her life. She sketched the view from her apartment window, the faces of strangers on the metro, the trees lining the snowy streets. Slowly, the act of creating became a balm, each stroke of graphite stitching her back together. It was during one of these moments, late on a quiet evening, that something remarkable happened. She was working on a sketch of the cafe where she and Leo had met, lost in the details of the chairs and the soft glow of the lamps, when the page beneath her hand began to shimmer. Startled, she pulled back, watching as the faint outline of a thread appeared on the paper. It glowed softly, winding its way across the sketchpad before vanishing into the air. Her breath caught. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the space where the thread had disappeared. The room around her shifted, and suddenly she was no longer in her apartment. Amara stood in a sunlit field, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. Above her, the sky stretched endlessly, a soft blue streaked with golden clouds. Threads of light wove through the air, connecting everything: the flowers, the trees, the horizon. In the distance, a figure stood waiting. Her heart leapt as she recognized him. "Leo," she called, running toward him. He turned, his smile radiant, and opened his arms as she collided into him. He felt real, solid, and warm, and for a moment she let herself believe this was her reality. "I told you," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet joy. "I'm always here." She pulled back, looking into his eyes. "What is this place?" "It's a convergence," he explained. "A space where the threads of existence cross over. It's rare, but when your heart and your memories align, you can find it." "Is this real?" she asked hesitantly, afraid of the answer. "As real as the love that brought you here," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Amara's throat tightened. "I miss you every day. And I'm with you every day," he replied. "But this moment is yours, ours. Use it to say what you need to say." Her tears spilled over as she gripped his hands. "I don't know how to let you go, Leo. I want to. I know I should, but it feels impossible." "You're not letting me go," he said gently. "You're letting yourself move forward. There's a difference." She nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. The golden threads around them began to hum softly, their glow intensifying. The field seemed to shimmer, the edges of the world blurring. "It's time," Leo said, his voice tinged with sadness. "No," she whispered, clinging to him. "Not yet." "Amara," he said, placing a hand over her heart. "You've already mended the thread. Our story isn't ending. It's changing. I'm part of you now, in every choice you make, in every step you take. You'll never be without me." She wanted to argue, to beg for more time, but she knew he was right. The love they had shared was eternal, woven into the very fabric of her being. "I'll carry you with me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Always." Leo smiled, his form beginning to fade into the golden light. "That's all I ever wanted." And then, like the threads themselves, he dissolved, leaving her standing alone in the field. Amara woke in her apartment, the sketchpad still in her lap. The cafe sketch was finished now, but at the bottom of the page, a new message had appeared. "Keep creating, Amara. Your story is far from over." For the first time in weeks, she felt a calm resolve. Leo was gone, but he wasn't lost. He was in her memories, in her art, in the invisible threads that connected her to the world around her. She picked up her pencil and turned to a fresh page. This time, she didn't sketch the past. She sketched the future. And as the first strokes took shape, she felt the threads of her life weaving forward, pulling her into the light of a new beginning.